August 1944, somewhere in the Pacific. The gates of a prisoner-of-war camp creak open. A column of captured Japanese soldiers, thin, silent, and dirt-streaked, are led inside under a blinding sun. Their faces are expressionless, not out of calm, but disbelief. Ahead of them, beyond the barbed wire, stands a wooden hut. A small sign reads simply, "Barber." Through the open door, they glimpse a captured Japanese private sitting in a chair, a white towel around his neck. A man, another prisoner, gently shaves his face with a clean blade. Next to the hut, shirts hang neatly on a line. A laundry building hums with steam and chatter. The newcomers freeze. Their minds cannot reconcile this scene. A prison camp where men are shaved, clothed, and spoken to like humans. For soldiers trained to die before surrender, this was not captivity. It was confusion. The war had taught them to expect cruelty. Instead, they found civilization. And this quiet moment of shock, was only the beginning of a story that would shatter Japan's most sacred code. To understand the shock of those Japanese prisoners, we must return to the roots of their beliefs, long before they ever stepped into an Allied camp. In pre-war Japan, the soldier's soul was forged in the iron mold of Bushido, the ancient way of the warrior. It was a code born from samurai tradition, elevated by the imperial army into something near religious. It demanded obedience, loyalty, and sacrifice without hesitation. But above all, it declared that surrender was the ultimate disgrace. A man who laid down his arms was not merely a failure, he ceased to exist with honor. This belief was reinforced every day in military training. Young conscripts were drilled to despise weakness. They were told that Allied troops, especially the Americans and British, were barbaric, merciless, and would torture prisoners. To be captured was to invite humiliation. To die in battle was purity. From the earliest days of the war, Japanese propaganda made sure this message ran deep. Posters and films depicted Allied soldiers as monsters. Textbooks for children taught that captured men brought eternal shame to their families. Officers told recruits, "Return victorious," or "do not return at all." And many didn't. At Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima, across every Pacific battlefield, Japanese soldiers fought to the last man. Those who could no longer fight often turned their weapons on themselves. Others clutched grenades to their chests, taking their own lives in fire and smoke. Surrender, to them, was not survival. It was self-erasure. Even the emperor's propaganda reinforced it. Radio Tokyo broadcasted that Japanese soldiers would never allow themselves to be taken alive. When Allied intelligence first began to receive reports of captured Japanese prisoners, the Imperial General Headquarters dismissed them as lies. It was unthinkable. Yet by 1943, the war's tides had turned. American firepower and logistics began to crush Japan's far-flung garrisons. Thousands found themselves cut off, out of ammunition, food, and hope. Slowly, inevitably, the impossible happened. Japanese soldiers began to fall into Allied hands, but what awaited them defied everything they'd been told. For many captured Japanese soldiers, the first minutes of captivity were filled with a kind of silent terror. They waited for the promised cruelty, the beatings, the torture, the humiliation their commanders had sworn would come. Yet it didn't. Instead, Allied medics tended to their wounds. Translators offered water. Officers recorded their names and ranks with military precision, not mockery. And then came something that truly unsettled them: order, discipline, and routine. These were not the chaotic prisons of propaganda nightmares. The Allied-run camps, from Australia to New Zealand, from the Philippines to the American mainland, were governed by the Geneva Convention. The captured were not to be slaves, but prisoners with rights: food, shelter, medical care, and dignity. Inside the camps, work was organized by trade and ability. Some prisoners were assigned to maintain gardens. Others, with tailoring skills, repaired uniforms. Barbers trimmed hair and shaved faces to prevent lice. Laundry details operated daily, washing the same khaki shirts and trousers that once symbolized the enemy. At first, the Japanese POWs were deeply suspicious. Many believed these comforts were a trick, a way to extract information or humiliate them slowly. They refused to speak, to eat, even to wash. But over time, the daily rhythm of the camp broke through the walls of fear. They saw captured Americans and Australians working beside them. They noticed guards who followed rules, who saluted senior Japanese officers, and who maintained discipline without cruelty. The camps functioned almost like small military towns, with schedules, inspections, and even educational programs. Letters were allowed. Religious services were held. Some camps even played music over loudspeakers during mealtimes. For men raised on the idea that the enemy was inhuman, this was disorienting. And in that confusion, something subtle began to change. Not immediately, not openly, but deeply. The prisoners, once terrified and defiant, began to see the enemy not as monsters, but as men. Yet for the Allied commanders, this humane system was not merely charity. It was strategy. Treating Japanese POWs well had a powerful psychological effect on both sides of the Pacific. Because the more the prisoners saw civilization where they expected barbarity, the more Japan's wartime myths began to fracture. For the Japanese soldiers, captivity was not just a physical imprisonment. It was a collapse of identity. Every morning they awoke to the same quiet order. The sound of boots on gravel, the whistle for roll call, and the distant hum of the laundry room. The smell of soap and clean fabric drifted through the barracks, a scent that felt almost unreal in war. In their minds, they were ghosts, men who should have died in honor, now forced to live among those they once swore to kill. Many could not look at their own reflections. Others refused to speak, maintaining a vow of silence that lasted months. Yet life inside the camps continued. Haircuts became routine. Rations arrived on schedule. And each small act of civility, a guard offering a cigarette, a doctor checking a fever, cracked the wall of propaganda a little more. To some, this was unbearable. They felt humiliation deeper than any wound. But to others, it stirred something unexpected. Doubt. If the enemy could act with respect, then what else had they been lied to about? For a nation raised on the myth of racial and moral superiority, this realization was devastating. Japanese officers watched their men adapt, learning English words, fixing uniforms, even smiling, signs of humanity returning where fanaticism once lived. Behind the barbed wire, two wars were being fought, one with hunger and discipline, and another inside the heart, between shame and survival, pride and truth. And slowly, the truth began to win. To the Allied command, the humane treatment of Japanese prisoners was more than moral obligation. It was psychological strategy. The Geneva Convention framed the rules, but behind them was a deeper objective: to erode the myth of Japanese invincibility, one prisoner at a time. In 1942, Allied intelligence realized something crucial. Every captured Japanese soldier who survived humane captivity was a living contradiction to Tokyo's propaganda. By ensuring their well-being, the Allies created witnesses, men who could one day return to Japan and tell the truth, that the enemy was not a beast, but a civilization that followed rules of war. This realization birthed an entire doctrine of psychological warfare. Camps became laboratories of morale. Reports were kept on POW behavior, attitude, and adaptability. When prisoners began to volunteer as barbers, carpenters, or tailors, Allied officers noted it as a sign of mental recovery, proof that humanity could outlast indoctrination. Meanwhile, propaganda broadcasts subtly highlighted this contrast. Allied leaflets dropped over Japanese garrisons mentioned the treatment of captured soldiers. Their clean clothes, medical care, even photos of them eating rice and smiling. It was an invisible weapon, targeting the hearts of men still fighting in the jungles and islands. But beneath strategy lay morality. Many Allied officers, particularly Australians and Americans who had seen the brutality of Japanese prison camps, chose to act differently. They wanted to prove a point, that civilization was stronger than cruelty. This moral stance stood in direct contrast to Japan's own treatment of POWs, where Allied camps ran with order, sanitation, and medical care. Japanese-run camps in Burma, Singapore, and the Philippines were sites of horror, starvation, disease, and forced labor. Over 25% of Allied prisoners under Japanese custody perished. And so, every haircut, every washed shirt, every shared meal inside an Allied camp was not just kindness. It was defiance. Defiance against barbarity, against hatred, against the idea that mercy was weakness. In that quiet defiance, a war of spirit unfolded. One that would reach its breaking point as Japan's empire began to crumble. By late 1944, the transformation within the Japanese POW camps was undeniable. What began as silent disbelief had evolved into reluctant adaptation, and, eventually, participation. The same soldiers who once saw surrender as dishonor now stood in line for haircuts, traded labor shifts, and joked quietly during meals. Their uniforms, once ragged and filthy, were mended by fellow prisoners who had become tailors. Shirts were pressed, buttons replaced, and boots polished. The barbers worked under tin roofs, cutting hair with borrowed Allied scissors. The laundry units ran every morning, steam rising like fog over bamboo fences. The camps smelled of soap, oil, and boiled rice. Life, against all odds, had a rhythm again. To outsiders, it looked almost ordinary. Men working, eating, and shaving. But within those small routines, something profound was happening. These were not just chores. They were acts of restoration. Each haircut symbolized survival over suicide, adaptation over despair. Psychologists later noted that grooming and hygiene had a powerful psychological effect on POWs. Cleanliness brought dignity, and dignity brought the will to live. For Japanese prisoners, once taught that surrender stripped them of humanity, this was a quiet rebirth. Some began to find pride in their work. Tailors sewed neatly, creating uniforms not of an army, but of order. Cooks experimented with rations, trying to recreate Japanese dishes from limited ingredients. Interpreters helped bridge language gaps between prisoners and guards. In one camp in New Guinea, an Allied officer recorded an astonishing moment. A Japanese POW barber offered to cut the hair of an Australian soldier. The two men, enemies only months before, stood in respectful silence. The barber's hands did not shake. When finished, he bowed slightly, an instinct of respect that transcended the war. Moments like these never made headlines. They didn't win battles, but they carried an invisible power. The power to humanize an enemy long taught to despise all weakness. For the Japanese command, such stories, when they reached home, were catastrophic. For the men inside those camps, they were salvation. Because for the first time, many realized that life after surrender was not dishonor. It was survival. And as Allied intelligence soon discovered, this awakening could be turned into something far greater than mercy. By early 1945, Allied intelligence officers began to notice patterns within the camps. Subtle, measurable shifts in Japanese behavior. Prisoners who had once refused to speak were now volunteering for work. Former officers, once aloof and defiant, began cooperating in administrative tasks. Even among the most hardened prisoners, curiosity about the Allies had replaced hatred. This was not coincidence. It was design. The Allies had learned that kindness, when used strategically, could open doors that no interrogation could. The intelligence branches, particularly in Australia and the United States, began to establish special POW interrogation centers where humane conditions and respect replaced violence and fear. At these centers, Japanese prisoners were asked about logistics, unit movements, and command structures. Many, once hostile, began to talk, not out of betrayal, but from a sense of fairness. They were treated like soldiers, not animals. That respect disarmed them more effectively than any threat. Interrogators often relied on cultural understanding. They offered cigarettes, tea, and the occasional Japanese newspaper. They engaged prisoners in conversation about family, poetry, and even Bushido, the same code that had once defined their loyalty. Over time, prisoners began to trust them, sharing intelligence that later saved Allied lives on Pacific battlefields. Meanwhile, the Allied psychological warfare divisions recognized another opportunity. They used testimonies from POWs in leaflets and broadcasts, assuring Japanese troops still fighting that captivity was not death, that those who surrendered were alive, fed, and even allowed to work. This message, carried by wind and rumor, slowly undermined Japan's military morale. Every captured soldier who lived became a living contradiction to Tokyo's lies. But this was not without moral conflict. Some Allied soldiers, especially those who had witnessed atrocities in Bataan or Singapore, questioned why the enemy deserved mercy. Yet commanders insisted discipline and humanity were the Allies' strength. Barbarity would only make them like the enemy they fought, so the system held. Camps remained orderly, clean, and carefully documented. Prisoners were encouraged to maintain hygiene, attend classes, and even draw or write. For many Japanese men inside those fences, this was their first experience of equality, a concept forbidden under imperial ideology. They began to see the Allies not as devils, but as humans who lived by rules stronger than hate. One Australian report from 1945 described it simply: "They came to us as warriors without hope. They left as men rediscovering life." That rediscovery would ripple far beyond the camps, shaping what Japan would become after its surrender. When Japan finally surrendered on August 15, 1945, a strange silence fell over the Pacific camps. The prisoners gathered around radios, some standing rigidly at attention, others staring blankly at the dirt. The voice of Emperor Hirohito, the Gyokuon Hoso, the jewel voice broadcast, echoed faintly in the humid air. For the first time, the living God spoke to his people, and he spoke of defeat. For the Allied guards, it was a moment of victory. For the Japanese prisoners, it was the collapse of their entire world. Men wept without sound. Some fell to their knees. Others, numb, simply turned away. Everything they had been taught, the divine destiny of Japan, the righteousness of its empire, the sanctity of death over surrender, had shattered in a single broadcast. Now, the war was over, but the struggle for these men was only beginning. In the weeks that followed, Allied officers began the process of repatriation. Ships and planes were arranged to return thousands of Japanese POWs to their homeland. Many were medically examined, photographed, and given clean uniforms for the journey. Yet, as departure day drew near, a growing number of prisoners hesitated. Some even begged to stay. They feared home more than captivity. In Japan, surrender was still shame. Families of POWs were stigmatized, and soldiers who returned alive were often treated as ghosts, reminders of dishonor. Villages whispered. Mothers refused to speak of sons who had been captured. Wives remarried, believing their husbands were dead. Or worse, dishonored Allied intelligence officers recorded cases of prisoners refusing repatriation altogether, choosing instead to remain in Australia, the United States, or even in Southeast Asia, working quietly under new identities. They found peace in the very nations they had once fought to destroy. Those who did return home carried an unbearable burden. Many concealed their experiences, never speaking of the barbers, the tailors, the laundry lines, or the humane order of the Allied camps. To admit that they had been treated well, to acknowledge that the enemy had shown them kindness, was to confess that everything they'd been taught was a lie. And yet, beneath the silence, something had changed forever. For the first time, captured Japanese soldiers had seen a world outside their empire's illusion, a world where discipline could coexist with compassion. That revelation would linger in their memories, quietly influencing the conscience of a defeated nation. In the years after Japan's surrender, the country lay in ruins, its cities flattened, its empire gone, its people starving. But from those ashes emerged quiet, unseen ripples, carried home by the men who had once been prisoners. Many returned in silence, hiding their status as POWs from neighbors and even family. Yet within them, the memories of Allied camps, the order, the respect, the humanity, refused to fade. For some, it was the first time they had experienced fairness from authority. For others, it was proof that morality could exist beyond the emperor's shadow. Historians later found diaries written by former prisoners describing their astonishment at Allied discipline. One wrote, "They shaved daily. They greeted us with words, not kicks. They worked hard, but not as slaves. I began to wonder if strength was not cruelty, but order." Those thoughts, once forbidden, began to reshape the defeated nation's soul. When Japan adopted its new constitution in 1947, renouncing war and elevating peace as a national principle, it was not merely the will of the occupiers, it was also the reflection of a generation that had witnessed the futility of fanaticism and the power of restraint. Some former POWs joined post-war reconstruction efforts, using their skills learned in captivity. Tailors opened shops. Barbers ran small businesses. Men who once maintained Allied laundry rooms now managed civilian operations in bombed-out Tokyo and Osaka. They rebuilt, quietly, steadily, with the discipline they had learned behind barbed wire. The contrast between their memories and Japan's wartime myths created a moral fracture that would define post-war culture. The Bushido ideal of dying for honor slowly gave way to a new creed: living for improvement. In Allied nations, too, the story left its mark. Reports from the POW camps were studied by military ethicists and psychologists, shaping the post-war understanding of humane warfare. They proved that discipline and compassion could coexist, that a clean shave and a fair meal could break the walls of indoctrination more effectively than torture. Decades later, some former Japanese POWs revisited the countries of their captivity. They met guards who had once watched them, now old men with trembling hands. There were no apologies, only quiet nods, shared silence, and understanding. The war had ended long ago, but the humanity that flickered in those camps, in a barber's hut, a steaming laundry, a pair of clean hands, endured far longer than any empire. In the endless library of war, most stories are written in blood, but sometimes they are written in soap, scissors, and silence. The tale of the Japanese POWs is not one of battles or victories. It is one of awakening. Men who had been trained to kill without mercy, to die without question, found themselves confronted not by the cruelty they expected, but by the discipline and dignity of their enemies. A barber's chair became a mirror, not just for their faces, but for their beliefs. A clean uniform became a symbol of survival, not shame. Through the quiet order of Allied camps, they discovered something the war had hidden: that strength and compassion are not opposites. They are reflections of the same human core. In every camp where a Japanese prisoner stood bewildered before a steaming laundry line or bowed after a haircut, a small truth was reborn. Civilization does not come from conquest. It comes from restraint. The guns fell silent in 1945, but the echo of that lesson still lingers. Because long after the flags were lowered and the soldiers went home, the memory remained of a war that revealed in its darkest hour that even enemies could preserve each other's humanity.